Hey guys, thanks for watching my video here. I wanted to share with everyone a little bit of work that I've been doing recently in exploring different properties of flops. As I look to group different flops and get a better sense for how my range should be interacting with my opponent's range in different formations, I wanted to take a lot of the work that has actually already been done so far in the forums by Moldyfish and by DLF on mass solving flops within GTO plus, and I wanted to try to use a little bit of my data analysis background to actually try to build a model and somewhat simplify this to be able to predict for all flops what are the different characteristics and what are the weights of those different flop characteristics that would contribute towards the overall EV for my range versus my opponent's range on different types of flops. Again, I wanted to share a little bit of the work that I've done with you guys so far. I put together a few slides, and we're going to spend a little bit of time going through those today. For this scenario, I have a relatively simple scenario. It's we're the cutoff, we raise first in, and we're flatted by the button, or by the big blind, excuse me, and we have 100 big blind stacks. Obviously, as the stack sizes change, as the formations change, as the ranges change, the insights that we actually get from this video will change, so this analysis is for this specific spot only, and would need to be redone for any different other formations or other stack sizes. So, and just so you get a sense for the A&E, I do some data analysis consulting work on the side, and that is the LLC and my logo that I've spun up for doing some of that consulting work. I just figured I'd throw it into the PowerPoint template that I have there. So nothing significant about the A&E. Those are my daughter's initials, and as well as my company's name. So today we're going to go through just a little bit about my problem statement and how I'm actually approaching this problem. I do have a little bit of a just primer on what a regression model is and a how-to for that, because I know not everyone here is going to be a data analyst. We'll spend a little time talking through the data setup. I'll talk through my different models, so how I actually started with a base kitchen sink approach and iterated down to a final model, and then just finish up with some strategic takeaways that I actually got from actually doing this exercise. So the problem that actually I run into here, and I think Moldyfish got this across in one of his videos, which is there's a lot of different factors that actually go into determining the advantage of a board, and those are things like what position that we're in, the various ranges that we have, the board textures, and a lot more, and that's really, really hard to accurately determine what the expectation value is unless you've spent the time actually digging through each of those individual formations, each of those individual boards and textures, and it's just hard to realize and understand how different components will actually affect increases or decreases in EV across the wide variety of boards that we have at the table. So, and just to show this too, I have this, I have 3 different boards here, and these are all two-tone boards, somewhat connected. They, again, the same scenario that we actually are walking through with this analysis, where we have 100 big blind stacks, a cutoff versus big blind, single raise pot with a 4 big blind open. The Queen Jack 5, where the top 2 suits here are the same. We have about 57% equity, and our EV is about 5.92 big blinds. The Queen 9-5, where the top and bottom suits are the same, we have about 54.6% equity, and our EV is 5.56 big blinds. And then the 9-8-4, where the top 2 are the same suits, we have 51.8% equity, and our EV is 5.17 big blinds. So, again, the problem that we run into is, these they're somewhat similar-ish flops. I mean, I guess, this is a 9-high flop versus these two are queen-high flops, but it's, in general, you may look at the queen 9-5 and the queen jack-5, two suits, and think, well, those are two very, very, very similar flops, but it's almost half a big blind difference that we actually have here in terms of EV, and that can be somewhat significant when we actually are trying to extrapolate this over the long run. So, how do we actually figure this out with any level of accuracy at the table? And that's what I was trying to understand with this analysis. So how I'm actually going about doing this is I had a few different steps here in this approach. So first, I actually took the 184 flop subset that was floating around on the PIO website, and I took that subset and I used that subset to represent the entire game, and I solved that whole subset according to this formation using GeoPlus. I analyzed that data set and categorized flops into some common descriptor variables, which we'll go through in a few minutes. I performed a linear regression model to determine the overall and the relative weighting that each variable has on the overall expectation value, and tried to simplify that into an easy to consume format. And from there was trying to determine the takeaways and strategic implications, and we'll get into this later on, but it's trying to repeat that, rinse and repeat for additional formations. So just again, a quick regression how-to. For those of you who are not familiar, linear regression is a basic type of predictive analysis, and it's probably the first type of predictive analysis that any data scientist learns. It's fairly commonly used, and it's the overall idea of that linear regression is to examine two things. First, does a set of predictor variables do a good job in predicting an outcome? Or a dependent variable. In our case, our dependent variable is the EV of a formation and a board. And then the second thing it tries to examine is which variables in particular are significant predictors of the outcome variable, and in what way do they actually impact the outcome. So I have this picture over here on the right-hand side, and what you end up seeing with a linear regression and what you see in general is that a lot of times you see a lot of data points, and when you capture a lot of data points, they may end up in this kind of scatter plot format, where if you look at it, they end up following some sort of linear relationship. And all a linear regression model is applying a trend line to this, a straight line trend line, and then figuring out what is the actual equation that creates that trend line. So that based on the data that we actually have, to understand, and once we have that equation, we can then use that equation to apply to future scenarios and predict where the EV of that other scenario would actually sit on this plot. So while the output of that regression model looks complicated, it is fairly simple. The output, this is what the output would actually look like, and again, this looks really, really, really complicated. I just took an example that I ended up having, I dug up from a business school example that actually I had, and this was a regression where our dependent variable was home prices, and the related variables might be some components that that contribute towards a home price. So our resulting equation here is at the bottom here, where we end up having the price is equal to our constant, which is this coefficient that we have here, times a coefficient plus a coefficient times the square footage, plus a coefficient times the number of bedrooms, plus a coefficient times the number of bathrooms, etc. So you end up seeing this this detailed equation, but this detailed equation does a fairly good job of actually explaining the overall model and the overall price of a home in this scenario here. There's a few things to actually look at when you end up looking at regression models. So first is this R-squared model, and an R-squared model is R-squared variable, and R-squared variable is just a measure of how much of that variance can be explained by the model. So the best you can get here is 1, and in that case there you're saying that 100% of the variance is explained by the model, and that's a perfectly linear situation. You're never going to end up getting those situations there. So really, the closer to the 1 the better, but a lot of times you end up seeing models that are in the 0.7, 0.8, or even 0.6 range. And what that represents here in this case, we're saying that this model represents about 86% of the variance, and it's about 86% accurate here in this case. All of these coefficients here, these are our weights, and these measure the impact that each component has with towards the overall value, with all other things being equal. So the way to read this is using this 265 example. For each additional square foot, assuming everything else is kept constant, each additional square foot adds an additional $265 onto the house. You can have dummy variables. So in this case here, east and west are where that house sits within town. So you're saying that east actually gets the houses on the east side of town get knocked a little bit, where the houses on the west side of town are worth way more than the ones on the east. And in this case here, it's just a binary variable. So you can't be in both the east and the west. So if you're in the east, this value is just 1, where the west is 0. So you cross out this coefficient here. And then finally, there's these p-values, and this is just representing the significance of the variables using our confidence levels. So something like this, where the value is 0, it means that it's very, very significant. We are extremely confident that this is an accurate representation of the relationship is very accurate, $265 per square foot, where something like this, the 0.5162, it means that variable is not necessarily significant, which doesn't necessarily mean we need to take it out of the model. It just means that it's, with all things being equal, it is not, either we don't have enough data points, or it's just not the most descriptive part of the model. So going into the setup itself, as I mentioned, I solved this within GTO Plus, and I have ranges that we have here. So our cutoff opening range, and I used the cutoff opening range that I had been working with and using. You can make an argument that this is not wide enough, or it's about 26% of hands, but this is the cutoff range that I've actually been using. And then the big blind flatting range, I believe I used an upswing range, but this is the range that I kind of put in here, and you see that we don't have any aces, kings, queens, or ace king suited, and we're discounting ace king off or ace queen suited a little bit, and we're discounting jacks a little bit, and some of these other hands kind of on the fringe here we're discounting a little bit as well too here. But it's about a 39% range versus our range, which is about a 26% range. Here's the scenario actually I solved it with, which is not really that important. I gave us multiple bet options on the flop, a small and largest sizing, as well as a 2/3 pot and over bets on the turn and river. Again, it's really not that important. Our EV will change slightly if we just keep this at 75% all the way through. It may not change too much. The big thing to note here is that we have a starting pot of 8.5 big blinds, because our EV is going to be a function of that. And when you actually solve this in GTO Plus, this is what that graph looks like. So we have our EV, and if you sort the EV from high to low, you see that this looks like somewhat of a straight line. So it does kind of trail off here at the end, and there are some of these flops here at the end which really trail off. But for the most part, we end up seeing a somewhat straight line in this situation here, which lends us to believe that we can apply a linear regression model to this set of flops. So what I have to do in this case here, so the way I have to actually set this up, and I'm using the expectation value as my dependent variable. I have to set up a bunch of independent variables, and what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to actually use dummy variables to actually do that. So I tried to think of how do you actually categorize flops, and what each flop is going to end up having some type of characteristic for each of these. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to come up with 5 different groups to actually categorize each of these flops. So first I did it with the ways in which we can actually get beat by the suitedness, the paired interplay, and how the cards, the connectedness of each boards. And I kind of coined them from, we get beat by flushes, we get beat by full houses, we get beat by straights. So for flushes, it's split up into rainbow flops, two-tone flops, and monotone flops. For full houses, those are either unpaired flops, paired flops, or trips flops. For straights, this is there a straight? Could you have flopped a straight? Could you have flopped an open-ended straight draw? Could you have flopped a gut shot? Or is there not a single straight draw present on the board? The fourth one is the groupings, and this is the groupings that I used. I think this was from one of DLF's analysis, and it's using just high, medium, high, low, etc. all the way through. I believe highs were aces through jacks, mediums was 10s through 7s or 6s, and then lows was 6s and below or 5s and below. I'm not 100% positive. I have that in the Excel spreadsheet, but it's essentially 3 high cards, and this one is 2 high cards and a medium card, etc. And then finally, I looked at what is the actual high card on a board. So I pulled out aces separately. I grouped kings and queens together, I grouped jacks and 10s together, I grouped 9s and 8s together, and I grouped anything 7 or lower together. You're obviously going to get better, more granular if you use all of these individually, but for simplicity's sake, and also I want to also be able to try to actually implement one of these things to the table, and for that sake as well too, I didn't think that I'd actually be able to get a lot of great insight out of things, so I decided to simplify a little bit here. So with that, let's actually jump into the model itself, and I want to actually show what I actually put together. So first things first, here is the actual data set that I got. So I took the flops and I broke it out to the cards and the suits. Here's all the equity and the EV that we have for the flops. I also ended up taking based off of, I just did a calculation if we were all in right now based on our EV, and then how much are we over realizing or under realizing, essentially based on what our overall expectation is versus if we just went off of a raw equity calculation. But that's really for another analysis. That's not necessarily important for here. For here, all we really care about is EV. And then I categorize each of these flops for whether they're a rainbow flop, whether it's a paired flop, gut shots, the grouping, and then the high card. Now, the second thing I did here is actually build a model data set. So the model data set here is, again, I kind of pulled all of these over, and for each flop, what do we care about? We care about the EV, and then we care about each of these different groups, and we can worry about this combo group in a second here. But for each of these other groups here, I created dummy variables for all of them. So I'll use flushes as an example. Flushes, you can be either rainbow, monotone, or two-tone. So our first 3 variables here are monotone, two-tone, and rainbow. And it's pretty straightforward. You get a 0 if you are not that value, and you get a 1 if you are that value. So in this case here, this 6 deuce deuce rainbow here is a rainbow flop. So we have a 1 in the rainbow category, and then a 0 in the other 2 categories. And it's the same way for all of these other categories. So again, that's a paired flop. So it's 0 for trips, 0 for unpaired, 1 for paired, etc. And we did that. I did that for all of the flops that we actually have, and all of the categories that we actually have throughout. And I believe there were 25 categories. That we actually did that, and I did that for all 184 flops. The next thing I did was actually look at the breakdown of all of our different categories itself. So a couple interesting points here. So overall on this formation, it's a fairly good flop for us, right? So it's, it's a fairly good formation for us. The cutoff should have an advantage over the big blind flatting range in a lot of scenarios here. And, in an 8.5 big blind flop, we have an average EV of 5.5. But there's a lot of variance in that here too. So the highest flop was that 6 deuce deuce flop up here, where our EV is 6.23, and the lowest flop here is and I'll actually have to see what that flop is. It's this ace 9-9. It looks like a rainbow. Yeah, so ace 9-9 rainbow flop, and that one our EV is 4.47. So so we have a very low minimum here, whereas the high is our is this maximum here. So our EV can vary by almost 2 big blinds in an 8.5 big blind flop. And then for some of these other values down here, I just showed how for our 184 flops how that 184 flops breaks out across our different categories. So 52% of our flops are two-tone, 40% of them are rainbow, and only 8% of them are monotone. 82% of them are unpaired, 17% are paired, and 1% are full trips. 41% have an open-ended straight draw, 33% has a gut shot, 15% has a straight on present, and 11% does not have any straight draw, and so on and so forth. You can see how the groupings work, and I think this was in another analysis too, which I think DLF's analysis, which the high, medium, low boards are the 25% of all boards that we have here in this 184 flop example, and then as well as the high cards. 23% of flops that we have in this study are ace high flops, 30% are king queen high flops, 23% are jack 10 high flops, etc. Just looking down at some correlations I did some correlations that for each of these boards with the EV, and you start seeing the foundations of some of the models. So things like monotone boards are negatively correlated with EV, rainbow boards are positively correlated with EV, straight boards, as you'd expect, are negatively correlated, where gut shot boards are actually positively correlated with EV. And you can see how the different groupings or the high cards are actually correlated with EV. One thing that's, again, we'll get into this later, I was surprised at the ace high boards being so negatively correlated with EV in this particular formation here. So moving forward to the actual model itself, first things first, I actually built the model where I threw everything into the model. And what you ended up getting was I got this R squared of 0.724, and that's a fairly good model. We're saying 72% of the variance is actually being explained by the model here. So what does this actually tell us? So we start seeing what our actual coefficients are, and this is what this equation represents is that you take this equation, which is our EV, and that's equal to, in this case here, 5.712 plus whether it's monotone or two-tone here. So if it's monotone, then we actually subtract 4.82. If it's two-tone, then we actually subtract 0.07 BBs. One thing you'll notice here is actually for all of these models, and I didn't mention this in the regression, you actually have to remove one of the variables for each of them, and that ends up being your reference variable. So I didn't forget about rainbow here. Rainbow is just baked into this constant. So rainbow boards, on rainbow boards, both of these are 0. And so what we're basically saying is that compared to a rainbow board, a two-tone board would be 0.07 big blinds less in EV, whereas compared to a rainbow board, a monotone board would be 0.482 big blinds less in EV. So my reference was, in this case, rainbow. My reference in the second one was unpaired boards. So we're saying that the trips boards are a little better than unpaired boards. The paired boards are a little worse than unpaired boards. Straights, on the straight boards, my reference is none. So we're saying that gut shots are a little better than no straight draws, whereas straight draws are worse, and open-ended straight draws are also worse, but not as much. On the last board, I believe I used low as my reference. So saying that compared to low boards, medium boards are worse. The high-low boards are better. High boards are the best compared to those. And then on the last one, I used 7 or lower boards as my reference. And versus 7 or lower boards, the king or queen boards and the jack or 10 high boards are better, whereas the ace high boards or the 9 or 8 boards are worse. So this is our first model, and it's a good first model, but again, it's throwing the kitchen sink at things. And we also have a lot of p-values here that are fairly high, which are, in this case here, insignificant. And it's somewhat hard to implement in the sense that I have to remember the formation of how the different cards group together as well as the high cards. So I thought, well, what's more important, the high card or the grouping of this? So the next thing I jumped into was actually I removed the high cards and I just looked at the grouping. So everything else is the same here except for the high card is gone. And what you end up seeing is the R squared for this goes way down. And it goes from 0.72 to about 0.42. And the relationships stay somewhat the same, but again, this is you lose a lot of predictive ability here by removing the high card. So the next thing I actually did was I decided to keep the high card in, but I removed the groupings, and you see the R squared here was 0.604. So my first big takeaway from this is when we actually look at the impact of overall factors on EV, the high card is actually much more important than the actual category of things. And what that's really going to mean is that a king or queen high flop, it's not going to really matter if it's a high medium or a high medium low or a high low low. They're going to kind of band somewhat closely together. The king or queen high is actually going to be the most significant factor in that formation there, and we'll see that kind of play out a little bit further here. So this is great here, but actually I do want to go back to my base model here because our R squared is better, and it is showing that there is, even though we have a R squared of 0.604 by using the high card model, we're getting better and somewhat significantly better by actually bringing in the high card and the grouping here. But a quick caveat here on this next note is that our flop grouping and our high card value, a variable, does have a degree of correlation there. So flops that are ace high are always going to have a high XX flop grouping. 9 high are always going to have a medium XX grouping, etc. And that can create a challenge when actually interpreting model results. For example, so in that first model there, on high low flops, we add, so we're saying these are favorable for us, so we're going to add 0.148 big blinds. But the ace high flops are actually somewhat unfavorable for us, so we're actually going to subtract 0.368 big blinds. And that's hard to do, and it's hard to actually implement that, because now I have to remember, oh, a high low flop is favorable, but an ace high flop is not favorable, and actually do the math and look at those two together. So I figured that I might see actually more value. Sorry about that. I might see more value in actually looking at that interactivity together. So and I'll get to this in a second, but while that might make things a little bit more complicated in terms of variables, actually I find that combining the two correlated dimensions into one measure can make it easier to implement. So just showing, and what I ended up putting this together was this fourth model here where actually I combine those two, and I have the high card, and then I put the low two cards in the grouping here. So we'll have an ace high flop, an ace high medium flop, an ace high low flop, etc. So, and that's what these data points are. If you go out from 26 on, it's the same thing, dummy variables here, but it's just grouping them into different combos here. So I built this model, and I found that this was much easier because this essentially it's the same thing. It's combining those two together, and I was actually into one value. But this way I don't have to remember actually that to do two different calculations here, I can just group them into what we end up having here in this case, which is 21 different categories of flops, and how important those flops are. The other thing we'll notice here is that our R squared actually goes up. So we actually get more predictive with this model too. So not only is this model somewhat easier for us to implement, which I'll actually show you that in a second, it's also a little bit better of a model as well. And the last thing I did here was, again, going back to the example of if we have our reference variables here, the one thing I wanted to do was I wanted to keep our constant as close to the average EV as possible. And the reason I want to do that is then I can have an easy baseline, which I know is the average baseline, and then I can implement a plus minus system from there. So I changed around some of my reference model variables, and I got this other model which is going to have the same exact R squared. It's the same exact variables here, but instead of using the none straight draw method, I use the open-ended straight, the open-ended straight draw was my reference, and then I believe I might have changed a combo group here, but either way I ended up getting to a situation where our constant was 5.499, and if we go back to our descriptive, our constant here was 5.501, so it's virtually the exact same EV here. So what that tells us then is that this is our baseline, which is our average EV, and then the presence of a monotone flop is going to drop that average EV by minus 0.49 big blinds. The presence of a straight is going to drop it by 0.209 big blinds, etc. So going back to our actual presentation itself, what does that actually tell us? So this is our resulting equation of what that model results, and that's I've broken this up into kind of our different areas. So it's 5.499. Then we add in our flushes, which again, these are binary variables. So if it is monotone, this is what gets subtracted, and the rest gets zeroed out. If it's a rainbow board in this scenario here, both of these coefficients actually get zeroed out. So we'll have our flush group, we'll have our full house group, we'll have our straight group, and then we'll have our combo grouping. And again, each flop only fits one value in each set of variables. The rest are going to be equal to 0. So I tested the model accuracy a little bit, and I threw one flop in here, and actually I threw a few more, but they all kind of fall on the same things. And this is important to note that all of these models are based off of a small set. And as we know here, this is 184 flops that we actually had that we threw into this model. If we ended up solving this in GTO Plus with 1,000 flops, we would likely have a much better model that would actually predict things a little bit more accurately because we would have a larger sample size. In this case here, it's good, and it's good enough. And so this ace 8-7 double suited board, where the ace and the 8 are the same suit, we have a 52.7% equity in GTO Plus. Our EV is 4.88 big blinds. Based on our equation itself, we actually would see that it's 5.499. It's minus 0.74 because this is a two-tone board. There is not a full house present. This is our reference here, which is a unpaired board. There is an open-ended straight draw present. So again, that was our reference, so that's 0. And this is an ace medium flop, which is in this case here worth minus 0.388 big blinds. So our predicted EV for using our regression model is 5.037 big blinds. It's a difference of 0.157 big blinds, but in this case here it's somewhat close enough. So a couple of different insights from this. So first, just looking at the different dimensionality rankings. This I thought was really super interesting here, and I've sorted this from high to low. So the different adjustments that we actually have. So from a flush standpoint, rainbow boards here are worth 0. So we're saying two-tone boards are slightly negative in our EV adjustments, and then our monotone boards are worth almost half a big blind less than our rainbow boards. So rainbow and two-tone boards are not going to impact our advantage that much from an EV standpoint, whereas the monotone boards are going to be fairly unfavorable for us as the cutoff razor. From a full house perspective, unpaired boards are kind of that middle baseline here. The trips boards, which are few and far between, they're actually going to be better for us, which is fairly obvious because we're going to have the aces, kings, and queens, and our opponents are not. So we're on those trips boards, we automatically have that top full house a lot more than our opponent does. The paired boards were actually worse, right? So this is this has somewhat of a negative impact here. The straight boards, so gut shots are actually somewhat favorable for us. No draws are somewhat favorable for us. I should have had a plus right there. Open-ended straight draws are our reference here, which is 0, and then straight draws are sorry, if there is a straight present on the board, that's worth minus 0.2 big blinds. What I found was most interesting was our groupings and how we kind of rate this from top to bottom. And I was really, really surprised at a couple things. So one, you can kind of see how different flops are banding together. So we mentioned earlier that the high card was a bigger factor, and you can kind of see how some of that is banded together. So Jack and 10 high boards, there are 4 different groupings of those boards here, and it's the Jack 10 low low, Jack 10 high low, Jack 10 high medium, Jack 10 medium low. Those are 4 of our top 6 groupings, and even the lowest one has a plus 0.3 big blind adjustment factor. So what that's telling us is that really all of our Jack 10 boards are going to be favorable boards for us if it's Jack or 10 high. King or Queen high is actually favorable for us as well too. They're all on this left hand side of the column. The 9 and 8 boards, which is not surprising to me, are somewhat neutral to unfavorable for us. But what was really surprising to me, and you think about this from a just any RFI perspective, and my initial gut going in is the ace high boards are going to favor the preflop razor, and a lot of that is because we have aces and we have ace king, and our opponent does not. Although they do have some ace king offsuit in that case there. But what I find actually, if we went back to the ranges, this is, and I'll just quickly go back to the ranges right here. While they don't have aces or ace king suited, they have all of the rest of the aces, but they also have all of these offsuit ace combinations. So if it is an ace high board, we don't have any of these ace high combinations. So that's somewhere in the range of 12 combinations for each of these offsuit varieties times 8 different instances here. I know some of this is weighted a little bit, but we're looking at another 80-ish combos that our opponent 80 to 90 to 100 combos that our opponent has in their range that we don't have, and that's going to severely impact our situation there on those ace high boards. So I thought this was fairly interesting that the ace high boards actually, while we may think that they're actually really good for us in this formation, based on our specific ranges in this specific spot, the ace high board actually is not the best for our overall range advantage. The second thing I wanted to actually do was look at just category insights here. So what I did for this was for each board I took the max value and the min value, and I subtracted to see what's the overall range that we actually have from the best possible scenario to the worst possible scenario. So flushes, on the rainbow boards it's 0, on the monotone boards it's 0.493, so that's a range of 0.493. For full houses, the best is 0.174 positive, the worst is minus 1.55, so when you subtract that out, there's a difference of 0.329 big blinds. So I did that for all of these boards. So not surprisingly, you end up seeing that the grouping is the biggest impact and can have the biggest variability on the overall EV. So I took each of these ranges and I said that, okay, well, the grouping, each of these values is as a total percentage of the pot, which is, you can see somewhat of an impact here, but then I also took it off of the maximum range, which, if you remember back, our maximum EV on the flop was something like 6.2 big blinds, where our lowest one was like 4.47 big blinds. So there was almost 2 big blinds of a max range. If we have not even just under 2 big blinds, 54% of that could have been is impacted by the variability in our groups here. So the best group is worth almost a full big blind better than the than the worst group. So as expected here, that grouping can be the most significant factor here. As we mentioned here, whether we have the advantage, the range from the best grouping to the lowest grouping can yield a 17% swing in our EV, which is the percentage of the pot, and account for 54% of the overall delta that we actually have here. We also see how they weight relatively to one another. So we see that the grouping has the biggest impact in our overall EV. The second biggest is flush draws. The presence of flush draws, it's the second most powerful factor, whereas full houses and straight boards actually impact things a little bit less. So as you're actually trying to categorize, and I'm learning that as we're looking at this value here, as we're trying to categorize in this formation here, whether a board is advantage to us or to our opponent, it's best to start with this grouping first, and then utilize these other variables as additional components to layer on. So as long as I know that there's a jack high, if it's a jack or a 10 high board, I can say that's fairly positive for us, and then make some adjustments, maybe a negative adjustment if it's a monotone board, or a negative adjustment if it's a paired board, or maybe a positive adjustment slightly if it's if there's a gut shot present but nothing else. So I can pull all of these together but I can really start with this baseline of looking at these high card groupings, because that's going to be a larger portion of a representative of the larger portion of the overall EV change. So what are my final takeaways from this analysis? So, I think there's a lot more to do here, and we'll cover that on the last slide, which is the next slide here. But the first is that the high card on our flop has a much stronger effect on our EV than our grouping or banding things together. And as a result, we should understand that while the interplay of all of our 3 cards adds nuance, the high card is going to be the dominant one in our overall advantage or disadvantage of the board. The second takeaway that we actually have was we can actually add complexity, but at the same time, by doing so, we can reduce the difficulty of actually implementing things in game. And in practice by using that system here. So by blending those groups together, it may seem like I'm adding more variables there. I'm actually reducing the overall difficulty by being able to band different boards together and more accurately describe boards. The third strategic takeaway is that boards with a king, queen, jack, or 10 as the high card are particularly good for our range as the cutoff, and they lend to a range advantage for us, particularly those jack or 10 high boards. And we saw that in our analysis and in the output of our model there, is that the jack or 10 high boards were fairly favorable for us as it relates to the overall EV. The fourth thing is that despite the fact that we're a preflop raiser and we do have aces and ace-king in our board while our opponent doesn't, ace-high boards tend to have a lower EV for our range versus the big blind. And as we covered that, he has a lot more of those ace-x offsuit hands that have decent equity and can continue versus our range fairly well. So while he may not have that top-end range advantage, that kind of second component, it stays fairly good in terms of equity. That's just under top end. The top pair portion, he has a lot more top pair hands than we do. And then finally, adjustments from other factors, so such as the flush draws, the full houses, and straights, they give us a good net framework to determine how do we actually construct and how should we actually play our hand on a given board. And I'm still working through how to actually take that away from from just working in the lab or working here on a spreadsheet and actually implementing that in practice. So next steps, just some final thoughts that I have here. So I want to take a look at this and actually examine different variations within the same spot and see how much things change, whether I actually need to look at this a little bit different. So I'm going to slightly vary ranges, slightly vary stack sizes, slightly vary some bet sizes to see if that changes our takeaways at all. And that'll give me a sense of whether I actually need to look at this multiple times for the same formation, or if it's good enough to just look at it once or twice for each individual formation. The next is to actually look at things across different formations. So, we mentioned here some of the takeaways that we have here is from a cutoff versus big blind range. It's going to be a lot different when we're looking at it from out of position defends, or in position defends, or 3-bet pots. So looking at those different formations, we're going to yield some different analyses. The third thing is to actually develop some of those general takeaways that we can actually use in implementation. So this is great to do off the table, but I haven't gotten to a point yet where I actually feel comfortable translating this to in-game strategies. And that's actually what the last point is, which is trying to simplify things as much as possible and translating that into in-game applications. So that was my presentation, and if you've made it to the end here, thank you for staying with me for 45 minutes as I went through a lot of what I'm working on right now. Again, I think I've just really scratched the surface of really what could be done in this, and I'm sure that there's probably things that I may not have done perfect in the methodology, and I'm certainly open to any criticism or any thoughts that anyone has. So if you have any thoughts, let me know by leaving a comment below, or if you're in, I'm going to post this within the TBR forum, so please leave a comment there. Again, I'd love to dive into this a little more and shape this analysis a little bit more, but want to share this with everyone to get all your thoughts. So